Sabrina Hale had learned to live inside a marriage the way some people learn to live inside winter. By dressing for it, by moving carefully, by pretending the cold was only weather and not a permanent state. The vows had never been a home. They were a schedule, a list of obligations that could be checked off, documented, and presented to the right people with the right smiles. Her husband's world ran on inheritance and appearances, on old money that did not announce itself with noise, but with certainty. It did not need to be kind. It only needed to persist. The house in the northern suburbs of Chicago looked like a polished rendering from an architect's portfolio. Smooth stone, clean lines, minimal landscaping trimmed to a quiet obedience. The windows were large and uncurtained, as if privacy were unnecessary when everything inside was already controlled. At night, the interior lights made the glass glow like a display case. Cars passed on the street, and their headlights slid across the facade, briefly animating the house with motion that never reached the people living in it. Sabrina used to stand at the kitchen sink and watch those reflections, thinking about how glass could separate sound from sight, how easily a life could be visible yet unreachable. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of detergent and expensive wood. There were fresh flowers arranged by staff who never lingered long enough to become familiar. The rooms were too large for spontaneous warmth, too curated to be used carelessly. Everything had its place, and Sabrina had been assigned her own. She was the wife, the face, the part of the story that made the Taylor name look stable. She was also the problem that needed to become a solution, a child. Chris Taylor moved through the house as if he owned not only the walls but the oxygen between them. He was handsome in the way men were handsome when they had never been asked to doubt themselves. His suits fit like a second skin. His voice, even when low, carried the assumption of being heard. He did not need to raise it. People adjusted before he did. Sabrina had watched that effect ripple outward at dinners, at charity galas, in the presence of his friends who laughed too quickly and his mother who observed too quietly. He had been unfaithful for so long that betrayal no longer felt like an event. It was an atmosphere. The earliest incidents had been punctuated by apologies that sounded rehearsed, by brief stretches of attention that were meant to be reassuring. Then the apologies faded. The attention became transactional. The affairs turned into public knowledge in private circles, the kind of knowledge nobody admitted to having. Sabrina learned to carry herself through those rooms anyway. She learned how to tilt her head, how to keep her hands steady on a champagne flute, how to meet someone's eyes without inviting their pity. If she stayed, it was not because she believed in change. She stayed because she had once made a promise that had lodged itself under her ribs like a small, sharp object. Raymond Taylor, Chris's father, had been the only person in that family who spoke to her as if she were real. He had been dying when he asked it of her, and he had asked it in the language of legacy, not love. The Taylors needed an heir. Chris needed a purpose. The family needed continuity. Sabrina had agreed because she still believed that duty could be a kind of safety. And because on that day she had looked at Raymond's pale face and decided she would not be the woman who refused a dying man. After he died, the promise remained, but the tenderness behind it disappeared. Sabrina became the keeper of an obligation that nobody thanked her for. The years that followed were measured in ovulation tests and clinic appointments, in the quiet humiliation of medical forms that reduced her to reproductive potential. She endured it with the same discipline she used for everything else. She learned the vocabulary of hormones, the sterile timing of cycles, the way doctors avoided eye contact when they did not have answers. She learned to swallow disappointment before it reached her mouth. She learned to pretend she wanted what they wanted, as if wanting would make it less like surrender. By the time she finally saw the positive test, she had already rehearsed what she would feel. In her imagination, the moment had been relief with a halo, something bright enough to justify the years. The reality arrived in silence. It was early, the hour when the house was still mostly asleep and the light outside was the color of metal. Sabrina stood in a bathroom that looked like a boutique hotel. Pale stone, spotless mirror, a scent diffuser exhaling something clean and expensive. Her bare feet were cold on the tile. She stared at the small white stick in her hand as if it were a document, something that needed to be verified before it could change anything. 2 lines appeared with calm certainty. There was no drama, no suspense. Just confirmation. Her body did not flood her with joy. It did not soften her. It simply shifted into a new reality, and her mind followed with the same controlled caution it always used. Relief came first, but it was not sweet. It felt like finishing a task at the end of a long shift, looking up from the last email sent, the last form filed, and realizing the reward was simply permission to keep going. She pressed her palm against the sink and exhaled, listening to her own breath as if it belonged to someone else. In the mirror, she looked the same. A woman in her late 20s with careful hair and a face that had learned how to hide exhaustion behind moisturized skin. She had the kind of beauty people called elegant because it was safe to compliment. Her eyes were clear, but there was something behind them that never rested. She had forgotten what she had once looked like before she learned to be composed at all times. She cleaned the evidence away quickly, not out of shame but out of instinct. In this house, information was currency. You did not leave it lying around. She washed her hands longer than necessary, watching water run over her fingers, thinking about how something so small could become a chain. The child she carried would be loved by her. She knew that without hesitation, but she also knew what else the child would be. Leverage. A pawn. A reason for people to stay close to her, not because they cared, but because the baby would be the next Taylor. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and trousers that made her look like herself in every public photograph. She went downstairs with the test result sealed inside her mind, like a secret kept behind teeth. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of appliances and the soft movements of staff who worked around her with practiced invisibility. Someone had already laid out breakfast options. Fruit sliced perfectly, bread warmed just enough, coffee that smelled like comfort without delivering it. Sabrina took a cup and sat at the island. The glass wall facing the backyard showed a lawn cut too precisely to feel alive. Beyond it, leafless trees stood in thin lines, and the sky was the flat gray of a city waking up without enthusiasm. She watched her reflection faintly overlaying the yard, a ghost in her own house. She thought about telling Chris. She imagined it as an announcement that would change him. A child, an heir, something he had claimed to want. But then she remembered all the ways he had treated wanting as an excuse, not a commitment. She remembered how he had spoken about the future with the same detached tone he used for business acquisitions. She remembered his ability to turn any human event into a transaction. Still, she needed to say it soon. Not because she wanted his reaction, but because secrecy had an expiration date. In this family, news moved faster than morality. If she did not control the narrative, someone else would. She carried her coffee through the hallways, past framed photographs that documented a life that never really existed. The wedding portrait with Chris's hand resting possessively on her waist, charity events, where they stood beside donors and smiled for cameras. A holiday shot in front of a fireplace she had never lit herself. The images were heavy with intention, designed to convince the world that their marriage was a structure worth believing in. She heard movement upstairs before she saw anyone. The house had a way of amplifying small sounds as if it wanted every footstep to be noticed. Sabrina climbed slowly, not because she hesitated, but because she was listening. The air felt different, tighter, as if the house itself were holding its breath. At the top of the stairs, the corridor opened into a wide landing with a tall window at the end. Morning light slid through it and hit the polished floor, creating a pale strip like a blade. Sabrina walked along it, her shadow stretching thin and sharp. Chris's office door was slightly ajar. She could hear voices. At first, she assumed it was a call. He was always on calls, always conducting parts of his life through other people. But the sound was not distant or filtered. It was close, intimate in a way that did not belong to professional rooms. A laugh, soft, feminine. Then the low murmur of a man's voice, the kind that suggested proximity. Sabrina's fingers tightened around her cup. She stopped outside the door and looked at the gap. She did not need to push it open. She could already see enough through the glass panel built into the upper half, a design choice meant to suggest transparency while still offering control. Inside, the room was dimmer than the hall, blinds drawn partway down. Chris stood near the desk, close to a woman Sabrina recognized only as a silhouette of familiarity. Long hair, confident posture, a body angled as if she belonged. Sabrina did not hear words clearly. She did not need to. The scene spoke in posture and distance. Chris's hand was at the woman's waist. The woman's fingers rested on his wrist like a claim. It was domestic, casual, practiced. Not a mistake, not a sudden lapse. It was a routine performed inside Sabrina's life as if her presence were irrelevant. For a moment she felt nothing. The shock did not strike like lightning. It spread like cold water, seeping outward, numbing first and then tightening. Her stomach did not twist with jealousy. Her lungs did not seize with heartbreak. Instead, her mind sharpened, focused, clinical. She cataloged the details the way she had learned to do in survival. The time of day, the location, the fact that he had brought someone into the house again. The fact that he had not bothered to close the door. That was the real insult. Not the affair itself, but the carelessness. The assumption that she was not worth hiding things from because she could not punish him anyway. The house, the money, the legal bindings, the promise she had made, everything had trained him to believe she would absorb any wound quietly. Sabrina stood still, her coffee cooling in her hand. She watched them as if they were strangers in a documentary about people who never learned empathy. The woman turned her head slightly, and Sabrina saw a flash of her face. Beautiful, younger than Sabrina by a few years, the kind of beauty that was sharp rather than refined. There was appetite in it. There was ambition. The woman leaned in closer, and Chris's expression softened in a way Sabrina had not seen directed at her in months. Something inside Sabrina shifted. It was not rage, not yet. It was clarity. The pregnancy in her body suddenly felt heavy, not because it was unwanted, but because she understood what it would mean inside this house. If she told him now, with that woman in front of him, the child would be claimed instantly. The baby would become a public asset, a triumph. Sabrina's body would be reduced to a vessel that finally did what it was supposed to do. Her pain, her years, her promise would be rewritten as the family's success. She stepped back silently. The floor did not creak. The house was expensive enough to keep secrets, at least when it wanted to. She walked away from the door without letting them see her. She moved down the hallway, her reflection following her in the framed glass of photographs. In those images, she looked happy. In reality, she felt composed in a way that frightened her. The absence of emotion was not emptiness. It was a door closing. By the time she reached the staircase, her hands were steady. She set the coffee cup down on a side table as if it were nothing. She placed her palm on the banister and descended one step at a time, feeling the house around her like a living creature. It held her. It displayed her. It did not protect her. In the kitchen, the staff continued their quiet work. Sabrina stood at the sink again and watched the backyard through glass. Outside, the world looked clean and controlled. Inside, the glass was flawless and still. It made everything appear calm even when it was not. She pressed her fingers against her lower abdomen, a small, private gesture. The life inside her was real. It was hers. And it had become, in the span of one morning, both her anchor and her greatest risk. Sabrina understood then that her marriage had never been the cage. The cage was the story they had written around her. Obedient wife, grateful recipient of wealth, quiet woman who tolerated humiliation in exchange for security. The pregnancy threatened to lock that story in permanently, to bind her to the Taylors not just legally, but biologically. If she stayed, the child would grow up in a house where love was conditional and power was inherited like a disease. The realization did not make her cry. It made her think. She pictured the next few hours as a series of decisions. She could confront him and let the house swallow the moment, turning it into yet another compromise. She could announce the pregnancy and watch it become a weapon. Or she could wait. She could collect proof. She could choose timing. She could decide how much of herself she was willing to lose for a promise made to a dead man. Outside, a car passed and its reflection slid briefly across the kitchen window, a pale streak of motion that vanished as quickly as it came. Sabrina watched it and felt something dark and steady settle into place. Not hatred, not revenge, a boundary. Her life had been built on glass, transparent enough for the world to admire, strong enough to keep her inside, fragile enough to shatter with one precise strike. She had just discovered the crack, and somewhere deep in her, beneath the practiced composure, a new instinct began to wake. She was pregnant. She was not safe. And for the first time in years, she did not feel like waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. The collapse of the marriage did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a negotiation. Sabrina understood this before anyone bothered to explain it to her. The moment the lawyers appeared, the moment schedules replaced arguments, the moment her name became a variable instead of a person, she recognized the familiar structure. This family did not process loss through grief. It processed it through contracts. What had broken was not a relationship, but an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. The first offers were delivered with clinical politeness. Money framed as generosity, a condominium downtown framed as freedom, monthly compensation framed as respect. Each proposal carried the same underlying instruction: disappear cleanly, quickly, without noise. Do not stain the narrative. Do not invite questions. Do not become inconvenient. Sabrina listened without reacting. She had learned that visible resistance only encouraged pressure. Silence, on the other hand, unsettled them. The Taylors were used to people who wanted more. They were not prepared for someone who wanted something specific. She did not ask for the largest sum. She did not ask for multiple properties. She asked for one house. The northern property had always been treated as an afterthought. It was old by Taylor standards, a brick estate tucked into a quiet stretch of the city where money had once meant permanence rather than spectacle. Compared to the glass towers and gated compounds the family now preferred, the house looked almost modest. It did not impress. It endured. The first time Sabrina mentioned it, the reaction was immediate and wrong. The room shifted. Faces that had remained carefully neutral tightened by a fraction. Someone asked her if she was sure. Someone else suggested it was impractical. The house, they said, was expensive to maintain, outdated, sentimental, not worth the trouble. That was when she knew she had found the correct leverage. She did not yet understand why the house mattered, only that it did. Instinct moved faster than logic. The same instinct that had told her not to announce her pregnancy, not to confront Chris in the doorway, not to trust the first kindness offered after years of neglect. Something in the way the Taylors deflected confirmed that the property was not merely real estate. It was a fault line. Sabrina requested the documents. They arrived in heavy folders that smelled faintly of dust and leather, the kind of paperwork that carried history in its margins. She spent long evenings alone with them, sitting at the dining table of the suburban house that no longer felt like hers, reading every clause slowly. Ownership transfers, trust arrangements, restrictions that no one had bothered to explain because they had never expected her to ask. The house had been protected. Not publicly, not dramatically, but deliberately. Old language appeared in the margins, remnants of a time when the family had been less careful about disguising fear as confidence. The property could not be transferred to certain parties. It could not be used as collateral under specific circumstances. Its sale triggered conditions that affected assets far beyond its assessed value. It was a keystone, disguised as a relic. Sabrina imagined the man who had written those clauses. She pictured someone older, cautious, perhaps aware that the family he was building would one day consume itself if left unchecked. The thought made her strangely calm. Someone before her had seen the danger. Someone had tried to slow it down. The Taylors did not like being reminded of past limits. When negotiations resumed, the tone hardened. The offers became sharper, less indulgent. The language shifted subtly, from persuasion to warning. Sabrina felt it as pressure rather than threat. The suggestion that she would be better off taking cash now. The implication that refusing generosity could lead to complications. The unspoken reminder that she was still legally tied to a powerful name. She did not flinch. What surprised her most was how steady she felt. There was fear beneath the surface, yes, but it was no longer in control. The pregnancy anchored her in a way she had not anticipated. The child inside her was not abstract. It was not theoretical. It was real, and it demanded decisions that extended beyond her own endurance. She could no longer afford to choose the path of least resistance. The divorce proceedings moved quickly once it became clear she would not be bullied into a broader settlement. Speed favored the Taylors. Silence favored them too. They expected her to crack eventually, to trade principle for comfort, to accept that survival required compromise. Sabrina signed nothing without reading it twice. She learned how much power existed in timing, how delaying a signature could unsettle men accustomed to instant compliance, how withholding emotion made people reveal their priorities. She watched patterns emerge. Who argued hardest against the house? Who avoided the topic entirely? Who suddenly became eager to close the deal? Chris remained mostly absent from these discussions, present only in name. His detachment confirmed what she already knew. The marriage had never been about partnership. It had been about placement. She had occupied a role, and now that role was being vacated. When the final agreement arrived, it was thinner than the initial proposals. Fewer concessions, fewer gestures. The Taylors had decided the house was an acceptable loss, or at least a controllable one. Sabrina understood that this did not mean they had stopped wanting it. It meant they believed they could reclaim it later. The transfer was executed quietly. Sabrina walked through the northern house for the first time as its owner on a gray afternoon that blurred the edges of the city. The property sat behind wrought iron gates that bore the marks of age rather than neglect. The brick facade was darkened by decades of weather, ivy tracing its way up one side like a living memory. The windows were tall and narrow, their frames solid, unyielding. Inside, the house smelled of wood and stone and something older, something patient. The floors creaked softly beneath her steps, not in complaint but in acknowledgement. This was not a place built to impress strangers. It was built to last through generations that might not deserve it. Sabrina moved from room to room slowly. The ceilings were lower than in the suburban house, but the space felt warmer, more human. Light entered through angles rather than expanses. The walls carried marks where paintings had once hung, where furniture had been moved and replaced. This house remembered people. In the study, she found a built-in bookshelf that extended from floor to ceiling. One panel did not align perfectly with the others. The discrepancy was subtle, the kind that would escape a casual glance. Sabrina pressed her fingers against it and felt resistance. Something solid lay behind the wood. She did not force it open. Not yet. Standing alone in that room, she understood what she had taken possession of. Not just a house, but a position. A line drawn quietly in the long war between control and autonomy. The Taylors would not forget this. They would not forgive it. They would begin to circle. The realization did not frighten her as much as she expected. For the first time since the test had turned positive, Sabrina allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by other people's expectations. The house would need work. The legal protections would need reinforcement. She would need allies, expertise, security she had never required before. The path ahead was narrow, and it would not forgive hesitation. She placed her hand over her abdomen again, a habit forming without conscious intent. The child inside her shifted, unseen, unknowable, yet already altering the shape of her life. She was no longer negotiating for herself alone. As evening settled over the property, the house grew quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the transfer of power that had just occurred within its borders. Inside, Sabrina stood at the threshold of something she could not yet name. She had taken the one thing they did not want to lose. And in doing so, she had made herself visible in a way she never had been before. When Sabrina returned to her family, the change felt physical, as if her lungs had been operating at half capacity for years and had only now remembered their full range. The house where she grew up was not gentle, but it was honest. Its walls held arguments, discipline, long silences, and expectations that were never disguised as affection. That honesty steadied her. Her father did not soften toward her, did not apologize for the past, did not attempt to compensate with tenderness. Instead, he gave her structure, clear rules, clear boundaries, a place where decisions were followed by consequences rather than manipulation. It was the first solid ground she had felt beneath her feet in a long time. Her brother became a presence rather than a protector, the kind of quiet reassurance that did not smother. He paid attention without hovering, positioned himself instinctively between her and anything that looked like a threat. Her sister moved through the house with a different energy, reminding Sabrina through small, unremarkable gestures that care could exist without cost. Meals shared without scrutiny. Questions asked without interrogation. Support that did not demand repayment. But stability, Sabrina quickly learned, did not equal invisibility. The house on the north side of the city began to attract attention with the precision of a beacon. At first it was subtle. Letters from law firms she had never contacted. Emails from consultants who spoke as if they were already involved. Calls that referenced zoning concerns, historical preservation issues, redevelopment opportunities. The language varied, but the subtext remained consistent. They knew what she owned. They knew it mattered. And they believed she would not know how to defend it. Sabrina watched the pattern form without panic. She had lived too long inside other people's strategies not to recognize the early stages of pressure. Information gathering disguised as assistance. Offers framed as favors. A gradual attempt to redefine her position from owner to obstacle. She did not answer immediately. She logged everything. She cross-checked names. She noted which inquiries appeared coordinated and which felt opportunistic. And as the noise increased, so did her awareness of what she lacked. She had legal representation, yes. She had family backing, yes. But what she did not have was a system. She was reacting, not controlling. The realization unsettled her more than the threats themselves. The recommendation came from a source she trusted precisely because it was not enthusiastic. A contact of her father's mentioned a man whose name surfaced only when problems had already grown teeth. Not a fixer in the theatrical sense. Not someone who erased trouble. Someone who reorganized it until it lost momentum. Damian Gray did not arrive with ceremony. The first time Sabrina saw him, he was already inside the house, standing near the entryway as if he had always belonged there. He was tall, built with a restraint that suggested strength was a tool rather than an identity. His presence altered the room in a way that was difficult to articulate. He did not dominate space. He clarified it. The air around him seemed to settle, as if everything extraneous had been quietly dismissed. He wore no visible luxury. His clothes were functional, precise, chosen for movement rather than display. His face carried the kind of stillness that came from years of assessing environments faster than others noticed them. His eyes did not linger. They catalogued. Corners, exits, lines of sight. When his gaze passed over Sabrina, it did not pause in evaluation of her appearance. It registered her as a factor. That distinction mattered more than she expected. Gray did not introduce himself with credentials. His history surfaced indirectly, through context rather than explanation. Former officer, specialized operations, years spent in environments where assumptions got people killed. Now head of security for a development firm that operated where money and risk overlapped. He had been hired to protect assets, executives, information. He approached Sabrina's situation as a configuration problem, not a personal drama. He began working without announcement. Within days, the tone of the inquiries changed. Calls stopped arriving at random hours. Emails became cautious, more formal, stripped of familiarity. One firm withdrew an offer entirely. Another adjusted its language, referencing Sabrina's ownership with newfound respect. Gray had not confronted anyone openly. He had simply mapped the network and applied pressure at points where resistance was inefficient. Sabrina observed the process from a distance at first. She noticed new routines forming around her without being imposed. Cars she did not recognize appeared and disappeared at consistent intervals. The perimeter of the North House was assessed, then subtly altered. Lighting adjusted. Access points redefined. None of it felt invasive. There were no visible guards, no theatrical displays of security, just absence. The absence of easy entry. The absence of coincidence. When Gray reviewed documents with her, he did so with an economy of language that bordered on severe. He identified weaknesses without dramatizing them. He did not soften facts to spare her discomfort. He assumed she preferred truth to reassurance. That assumption created an unexpected alignment between them. He treated her pregnancy with professional neutrality. Not indifference, but respect for privacy. He adjusted variables accordingly, factoring risk without centering it. Sabrina realized how accustomed she had become to having her body treated as public property. Gray's restraint felt like a kind of dignity. She began to notice the way he moved through space when he thought no one was watching. The measured steps, the constant recalibration of posture. He carried himself like someone who had learned that control was not exerted through force, but through anticipation. He did not wait for situations to escalate. He prevented them from forming. What unsettled her was how safe that made her feel. Not protected in the sense of being shielded, but stabilized. The chaos around her no longer pressed inward. It orbited, unable to breach the perimeter Gray had established with systems rather than presence. For the first time since leaving Chris's house, Sabrina slept without waking to the sensation of being observed. She told herself the calm was situational, a temporary effect of competence applied at the right moment. She resisted assigning emotion to it. But some nights, when she stood alone in the North House and felt the silence hold rather than threaten her, she knew the calm ran deeper. Gray did not hover. He did not check on her unnecessarily. His updates were concise, his timing deliberate. When he spoke, it was because information mattered. When he was silent, it was because nothing required attention. That discipline contrasted sharply with the performative concern she had grown used to in her marriage, where attention had always been conditional. She began to understand that Gray was not offering her rescue. He was offering alignment. The difference altered the balance of power in ways that reached beyond logistics. Sabrina found herself thinking differently, planning rather than bracing, considering outcomes rather than reacting to them. Gray's presence did not replace her agency. It amplified it by removing distractions designed to exhaust her. The realization arrived gradually and without sentiment. She did not feel drawn to him in the way stories described attraction. There was no sudden warmth, no flutter of anticipation. Instead, there was recognition. A sense that this man understood the cost of control and respected it, that he did not confuse dominance with safety or protection with ownership. One evening, as she reviewed a report detailing the origins of several recent approaches regarding the house, Sabrina saw how close she had come to being overwhelmed. The web was larger than she had anticipated. Developers, shell companies, old family rivals resurfacing through proxies. Gray had identified them not as enemies, but as movements. Predictable, manageable, finite. She looked up from the papers and felt a shift inside herself. Gratitude, sharp and unfamiliar, edged with something else she was not ready to name. Gray was not a savior. He did not promise anything. He did not lean into intimacy or retreat from it. He stood where he was needed and nowhere else. That restraint made him dangerous to those accustomed to exploiting emotion. And to Sabrina, it made him something rarer than safety. He was stability, without obligation. As the days passed, the pressure around the house continued to recede, reorganized into something distant and controlled. Sabrina began to reclaim her time, her thoughts, her sense of self as a person who could choose rather than endure. She knew the calm would not last forever. The Taylors would not accept the loss quietly. Power did not retreat permanently, it recalibrated. But for now, the ground beneath her feet held. And standing just beyond the immediate circle of her life, Damian Gray remained constant, watchful, unintrusive. A man who did not ask to be trusted. A man who made trust possible anyway. The shift did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, disguised as persistence. Chris reacted to Sabrina's departure not with grief, but with offense. What unsettled him was not the loss of the marriage, but the manner of it. She had left without collapse, without bargaining, without pleading for reconsideration. She had taken the house, and with it a piece of authority he had assumed was permanent. For a man accustomed to obedience masquerading as loyalty, this was intolerable. He returned to the methods that had always worked for him. The first layer was surveillance. Not overt, not theatrical. Familiar cars appearing too often on adjacent streets. Old acquaintances resurfacing with casual inquiries framed as concern. Service providers suddenly requesting confirmations she had never been asked for before. Each action alone could be dismissed as coincidence. Together, they formed a pattern designed to erode certainty. The second layer was pressure by proxy. People Sabrina did not know reached out through people she did. Offers to simplify ownership. Suggestions that the house was becoming a liability. Warnings presented as friendly advice. The message beneath the surface was consistent. Holding the property would be exhausting, isolating, risky. Chris did not approach her directly. He understood optics well enough to know that confrontation would expose him. Instead, he positioned himself as the silent beneficiary of forces he pretended not to control. Brenda, however, was never meant to remain in the background. What Sabrina learned, through information assembled rather than revealed, was that Brenda's presence in Chris's life had never been accidental. Her family's involvement in real estate was not simply profitable, it was predatory. They specialized in distressed assets, legacy properties with complicated ownership histories, estates burdened by sentiment rather than efficiency. The North Side house fit that profile too well to be ignored. The land beneath it had been marked years earlier. Urban redevelopment plans had stalled, revised, resurfaced, then stalled again, each time adjusting boundaries and valuations. The house remained an obstacle in every iteration. Its ownership structure was unusually resilient, protected by clauses written decades ago with an almost paranoid foresight. Restrictions on transfer, conditions tied to lineage, provisions that prevented consolidation under specific entities. It was not a sentimental relic, it was a lock. The basement of the house became the focus. Not because of rumor, but because of absence. Records referenced storage that did not appear in any modern inventory. Old renovation permits hinted at modifications never completed on paper. Damian Gray identified the inconsistency immediately. The omission was too clean to be accidental. When the space was examined properly, it revealed itself slowly. Behind reinforced shelving, disguised as structural support, was a compartment that predated recent ownership. Inside it were documents sealed against time rather than moisture. Financial instruments that no longer existed in any registry. Trust structures that had been dissolved publicly but maintained privately. Evidence of assets diverted, shielded, buried where regulation could not reach them. And at the center of it all was the signature of Chris's father. The man had understood something his son never had. That power was not maintained through visibility, but through leverage. The house was never meant to be lived in comfortably. It was meant to exist intact, to remain untouched, to survive transitions that would erase less carefully designed holdings. The panic among those who understood the implications was immediate. If the documents surfaced, reputations would not merely suffer, they would collapse. Entire networks built on plausible deniability would be exposed as intentional constructs. The house was not valuable because of what stood on it, but because of what it contained and what it prevented others from controlling. Sabrina's position changed overnight. She was no longer the former wife clinging to an inconvenient property. She was the custodian of something dangerous. The tone of communication shifted accordingly. Threats replaced offers. Urgency replaced patience. Subtlety eroded. Chris escalated. Attempts were made to discredit her competence. Questions about her mental state circulated quietly. Concerns about her pregnancy were weaponized, framed as instability rather than circumstance. The suggestion that she was being manipulated by advisors began to surface, a preemptive strike against any narrative in which she appeared deliberate. He underestimated one thing. Sabrina was no longer alone in interpretation. Gray did not react emotionally to the discovery. He adjusted strategy. Access was restricted further. Information flow tightened. Sabrina was briefed not as a dependent but as a decision-maker. He explained risks without softening them. Exposure scenarios, legal contingencies, the difference between threat and bluff. He taught her how to negotiate without engaging, how to let silence do damage, how to refuse without justifying, how to recognize desperation disguised as authority. Sabrina felt the shift inside herself with clarity that surprised her. Fear did not vanish, but it reorganized. It stopped being paralyzing and became informational. She learned which messages mattered by how much effort went into delivering them, which warnings could be ignored by how loudly they were framed as concern. The attempts to intimidate intensified, then faltered. Those pressing her realized they were no longer dealing with someone who could be isolated. Gray's presence altered calculations they had assumed were static. He did not threaten. He documented. He did not block access. He rerouted it. He made engagement expensive. Between him and Sabrina, something unspoken formed. Not affection, not comfort. Recognition. They understood each other's tolerance for control. Both had lived in environments where dominance masqueraded as care. Both recognized manipulation without needing it explained. Their interactions remained restrained, professional, but charged with an awareness neither attempted to dissolve. The tension between them was not romantic in its origin. It was the tension of two people who trusted competence more than intention, who respected restraint because they understood its cost. Sabrina began to stand differently, speak with less preamble, end conversations without apology. She watched how Gray held his ground without spectacle and mirrored it instinctively. The house remained quiet, but the war around it sharpened. And in the center of it, Sabrina no longer felt hunted. She felt positioned. The pregnancy transformed from a private condition into contested territory. Until then, Sabrina had managed to keep it contained within the narrow circle of necessity. Medical appointments were scheduled under neutral pretenses. Clothing was chosen for structure rather than concealment. Her routines were disciplined, almost austere, as if control over the external could compensate for the vulnerability growing inside her body. She treated the pregnancy not as a celebration, but as a responsibility that required silence. That silence could not last. Chris sensed the shift before he confirmed it. He had always been adept at noticing changes when they affected his leverage. The subtle alterations in Sabrina's schedule, the increased security presence around the house, the sudden legal caution in her communications all pointed to something he had not accounted for. When suspicion became certainty, his response was immediate and instinctive. He did not see a child. He saw a claim. In his mind, the pregnancy reframed the conflict entirely. Assets could be negotiated, documents buried, reputations managed. Blood was different. A child meant continuity, inheritance, optics. It meant access that could be asserted morally even when legally contested. He recalibrated his strategy around that single fact. The first move was legal noise. Petitions were prepared not to win, but to destabilize. Motions questioning Sabrina's capacity appeared suddenly, citing stress, isolation, and the supposed influence of unnamed advisors. Requests for emergency evaluations were floated and withdrawn, just enough to establish a paper trail. Anonymous tips reached journalists known for framing private disputes as public concern. The implication was consistent. A pregnant woman under pressure could not be trusted to act rationally. Sabrina felt the pressure before she understood its full shape. Her body responded faster than her mind. Sleep became lighter. Sounds carried further. Every unexpected knock reverberated through her nervous system. The child's presence inside her, once abstract, became intensely physical. Each movement was both reassurance and reminder of what was at stake. Brenda reacted differently. For her, the pregnancy represented displacement. She had built her position beside Chris on proximity and timing, on being the visible future while Sabrina was relegated to the past. The existence of a child complicated that narrative irreparably. She oscillated between appeasement and provocation, attempting to secure Chris's attention while undermining Sabrina's credibility. Her efforts were less strategic than emotional, driven by fear rather than foresight. That made her dangerous in a different way. Information began to leak in fragments. Details of Sabrina's schedule surfaced where they should not have. A medical provider was contacted under false pretenses. A service contractor arrived at the house with instructions no one had issued. Each incident alone was minor. Together, they formed a map of intrusion. The escalation peaked one evening without warning. Sabrina returned to the house later than planned, her route altered at the last minute on Gray's recommendation. When security reviewed the perimeter shortly after, they found evidence of an attempted entry that had been abandoned midway through execution. Nothing dramatic, no forced doors, just a methodical probe that suggested rehearsal rather than impulse. It was the closest the conflict had come to physical violation. Gray responded without ceremony. Access points were reduced. Personnel were replaced without announcement. Communication channels were audited and severed where necessary. He identified the source of the leak not through interrogation, but through pattern disruption, observing who reacted fastest to sudden silence. Within hours, the network attempting to reach into Sabrina's life was effectively blind. He did not inform her of every detail. He gave her what mattered. That the immediate threat had been neutralized, that the routes of approach were known, that she was not being managed but protected. Sabrina understood the distinction intuitively. Watching Gray operate under pressure altered her perception of him. Until then, she had respected his competence and relied on his judgment, but she had kept an internal distance, cautious of replacing one form of dependence with another. That distance eroded when she saw how precisely he balanced force and restraint. He did not posture. He did not reassure unnecessarily. He acted as if the stability of the environment was his responsibility and nothing else mattered. It was not heroism. It was ownership of outcome. For the first time since the pregnancy began, Sabrina allowed herself to exhale fully. The child inside her responded to that release, a subtle movement that anchored her to the present moment. She placed a hand over her abdomen not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. This was no longer just her body under threat. It was a future being contested by people who did not understand its value beyond utility. Her resolve sharpened accordingly. She stopped minimizing, stopped deflecting. When legal communications arrived, they were answered decisively or not at all. When inquiries crossed into harassment, they were documented and redirected. She ceased attempting to appear reasonable to those who benefited from her compliance. The shift was noticed. Chris interpreted her newfound firmness as provocation. Brenda mistook it for manipulation. Neither understood that the pregnancy had not weakened Sabrina. It had clarified her priorities beyond negotiation. Gray observed the change without comment. Their interactions grew quieter, more efficient. Fewer explanations were needed. Decisions were made with mutual awareness of consequence. The tension between them deepened, not through intimacy, but through alignment. They stood on the same side of the line without needing to define it. Late one night, as Sabrina reviewed security reports she would once have delegated, she realized something with calm certainty. The child had become the front line of the conflict. And unlike the past, she was not standing there alone. The ending did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as a cut made with steady hands, the kind that stopped bleeding not because it was gentle, but because it was accurate. After weeks of pressure, Sabrina stopped reacting and began to finalize. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, that chaos was always someone's preferred terrain. Chris thrived in confusion, in vague threats, in shifting narratives. Brenda thrived in noise, in emotional storms that made people forget to check facts. Sabrina chose the opposite. She chose documentation, sequence, and timing. She moved the way a person moved when she understood that speed was not power, and that a clean conclusion required patience. Gray did not push her toward vengeance. He pushed her toward closure that could not be undone. He treated the situation like a living system with pressure points, vulnerabilities, and predictable failures. He had watched men like Chris before, privileged enough to confuse entitlement with authority, accustomed to winning not through merit but through access. He had watched women like Brenda too, desperate enough to weaponize proximity, skilled enough to conceal calculation behind performance. Both types relied on one thing above all else: people backing down when reality became too exhausting to hold. Sabrina refused to back down. The house had been the center of the conflict, but the real war ran through paper, through signatures and timestamps, through old clauses written in a language that seemed archaic until it became lethal. She returned to the basement with a different mind than the one she had brought there at the beginning. At first, the hidden compartment had felt like discovery. Now it felt like evidence. The documents were no longer objects. They were leverage that belonged not to those who had buried it, but to the one who held it openly without flinching. She started by verifying everything twice. Each piece was authenticated, photographed, and stored in multiple locations under different forms of custody. Nothing remained in a single place long enough to be stolen. Each action was designed to remove a single point of failure, because Sabrina understood how people like Chris treated systems. They did not fight the truth directly, they attacked the places where it could be lost, questioned, delayed. She assembled a legal sequence that closed doors rather than opened arguments. The first step froze the transfer routes Chris had been trying to exploit. The second step challenged the shell structures connected to the land, not by accusation, but by forcing audits that made silence impossible. The third step activated dormant clauses that had been written into the property's ownership history like a warning to the future. Those clauses did not care about emotion. They cared about control, about preventing consolidation, about locking certain entities out permanently if they attempted specific forms of interference. Chris found out in fragments, the way a man found out he was losing when the world stopped responding to his commands. At first, he attempted to speak through intermediaries. Advisors who had once approached Sabrina with polite offers now returned with a colder tone, phrasing threats as practical outcomes. They suggested compromise. They suggested settlement. They suggested she was overestimating her position. Sabrina did not answer them the way her old self would have. She did not explain. She did not defend. She responded only where necessary, and where she responded, she did so with finality. Then Chris tried to change the narrative. It began with insinuations that Sabrina was unstable, that the stress of pregnancy was influencing her judgment, that Gray was manipulating her for his own gain. The rumors did not spread as they would have months earlier because Gray had already dismantled the most obvious channels. He had identified who talked, who listened, and who sold information for the thrill of relevance. He reduced their access without drama. People who had once felt free to circle Sabrina suddenly found their invitations revoked, their calls unanswered, their presence treated as irrelevant. Silence became a filter. Those who mattered stayed. Those who did not drifted away. Chris escalated again, and this time the attempt was more personal. He sought to make the pregnancy the center of the dispute, not for concern, but for possession. If he could not hold the house, he could try to hold the future tied to it. A child could be framed as an heir. An heir could be framed as moral leverage. Moral leverage could be used to justify intrusion into Sabrina's life as if it were responsibility rather than control. He tried to build a case around that idea, assembling the kind of argument wealthy men used when they were losing, that their desire to claim was equal to their right to claim. Sabrina cut that line before it could fully form. She documented harassment. She documented surveillance. She documented the indirect pressure that had been applied to her medical privacy. She did not do it theatrically. She did it carefully, as if building a structure that would remain standing long after the arguments collapsed. The pregnancy did not make her weaker. It made her more precise. She understood what was at stake, and she understood that her child would inherit whatever she allowed to remain unresolved. Brenda's collapse was different, and it happened because she could not resist being seen. When she sensed Chris slipping toward obsession with Sabrina again, her panic sharpened into reckless action. She tried to anchor him to her through need, through visible attachment, through reminders that she was carrying what he wanted. She believed that if she could force him to declare loyalty publicly, the situation would stabilize. It did the opposite. The more she pressed, the more his attention revealed itself as something else. Not love, not commitment, but hunger for control he no longer possessed. And within that hunger, he began to look at Brenda with suspicion instead of gratitude. The contradictions surfaced like cracks in a polished surface. Medical claims that did not align with timelines, appointments that could not be verified, a pattern of convenience that began to look less like chance and more like performance. The financial thread connecting Brenda's family to the redevelopment pressure around the house became harder to dismiss. People who had once treated her as a tool now treated her as a liability. When audits began to ripple outward, the first thing that broke was not Chris. It was the fragile scaffolding Brenda's plan had been built on. She had been a weapon designed to seize property through emotional manipulation. Under scrutiny, she became evidence. The truth did not explode. It dissolved the illusion. Brenda's story could not withstand consistent questioning, and the people protecting it withdrew as soon as they sensed the cost. She lost her footing quickly because she had never had real ground beneath her. She had only had momentum. Chris was left exposed in a way he had never been before. He had always assumed that money could rewrite reality, that reputation could be curated, that intimidation could be disguised as dignity. But the mechanisms he relied on required cooperation from the world. Once institutions were forced to act, once documentation was submitted through channels that could not be bribed quietly, once people saw that Sabrina would not retreat, the world stopped cooperating with him. The most brutal part was not the legal loss. It was the social shift. A man like Chris measured power in reflection, in how people moved around him, in how quickly doors opened, in how often his name was treated as consequence. When those reflections changed, when advisors began to speak with caution rather than deference, when associates began to delay their responses, when the press lost interest in his narrative and focused instead on the documents that framed him as an overreaching inheritor rather than a wronged husband, Chris felt something he had avoided his entire life: impotence. The humiliation was quiet, and therefore it lasted. Sabrina watched it without satisfaction. Not because she was merciful, but because she was done. She had reached a point where Chris's downfall was not a victory she needed to savor. It was simply the removal of an obstacle. Her focus had narrowed to what mattered: the house, the child, and the right to decide what her life would become. After the final filings were confirmed, after the most dangerous routes of interference were sealed, the house itself seemed to change. The security system remained, but its presence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like boundaries. The corridors that had once seemed too quiet now felt restful. The windows that had felt like exposure began to feel like openness. The property did not become warm in a sentimental sense. It became stable. And stability, Sabrina realized, was the rarest form of comfort she had ever been allowed. Her body responded to that stability with a delay, as if it had needed proof before it could relax. Sleep came heavier. The tension in her jaw softened. Her appetite shifted from survival-driven to natural. The child's movement felt different too, less reactive, more steady, as if the small life inside her had been listening to the stress in her blood and now sensed the absence of it. Sabrina found herself placing a hand over her abdomen not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement of the frontier she had defended. Gray remained near, but he did not crowd the space that had opened. During the war, his presence had been functional, strategic, constant. In the aftermath, he adjusted with an intelligence that did not require discussion. He lowered the intensity of his interventions. He stopped anticipating her decisions and began observing them. He did not treat her like a client who needed direction. He treated her like a woman who had earned sovereignty. That shift mattered more than any grand gesture. Sabrina noticed the details the way she noticed structural flaws in a building. Gray's control was not possessive. It was environmental. He made things work, then allowed them to remain quiet. He did not demand gratitude. He did not leverage proximity as entitlement. He did not translate protection into ownership. He stayed, and that staying had weight. There were moments when Sabrina realized she trusted him without having decided to. Trust had formed as a byproduct of consistency, of restraint, of the way he reacted under pressure without becoming cruel. She had seen him dangerous, but never toward her. She had seen him cold, but never dismissive. She had seen him decisive, but never reckless. He acted as though the world was something that could be held in place through discipline rather than domination. And Sabrina had not known until now how deeply she needed that distinction. The attraction between them did not flare like a sudden romance. It deepened like a current. In the quiet after the storm, Sabrina began to feel it more clearly because there was no emergency to drown it out. It was not based on fantasy. It was based on recognition. Two people who understood what it cost to maintain control without losing themselves. Two people who knew that safety was not softness, but reliability. Sabrina feared that feeling at first, because her history had taught her that love was always a trap disguised as promise. She had loved once with her eyes closed, believing patience could be rewarded. She had learned that patience, in the wrong hands, became permission to be used. This was different. Gray did not ask her to shrink. He did not ask her to prove. He did not ask her to trade freedom for belonging. He did not press into her life to occupy it. He positioned himself where he could be useful and remained steady without demanding to be necessary. That steadiness became its own language. One night, long after the legal dust had settled, Sabrina stood in the front room of the house and looked outward. The city beyond the glass remained indifferent, the streets still wet, the light still cold. The world did not care that she had survived. The world never cared. That was its nature. But inside the house, the silence was no longer hostile. It was earned. Sabrina understood then that the storm had not ended because someone had spared her. It had ended because she had chosen not to break. She had chosen accuracy over emotion, structure over panic, and sovereignty over comfort. And in doing so, she had created a space where something rare could exist, a future that did not require her to disappear. She turned away from the window and let the quiet settle into her bones. Gray was there, not looming, not claiming the room, simply present in the way a strong structure was present, holding without showing off. Sabrina allowed herself to remain in that presence without flinching. She did not rush to define what it meant. She did not demand certainty from it. She accepted it as it was. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel the need to run from softness disguised as danger. She recognized the difference. With Gray, she did not become smaller. She became sharper. She became more herself. And the realization was not romantic in the childish sense. It was mature, quiet, and profound. The storm had passed. The silence afterward was not emptiness. It was the beginning of a life Sabrina could finally call her own. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.